Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well today. It is really an exciting opportunity to be here with you. I do considerably fewer speeches these days, so it's a special opportunity for me to get a chance to assess our progress on where we are on the global fight against hunger and malnutrition and share with you some thoughts going forward. But as I look around this room and see a lot of friends and colleagues, I'm a little nervous to share with you any thoughts going forward because folks like Ann and Rob and Julie and others and the rest of you know your excellent work has helped shape our country's ability to participate in and in many ways lead a global effort against hunger and poverty. So let me start just by thanking Schengen for your leadership. You have really, in your role here at IFPRI, helped to elevate the standing of this institution and the seriousness and rigor with which the world has data and information to tackle global hunger. And for that, and for your entire team here, we are all very, very grateful for your leadership. I also want to thank the entire Forman family. I think it's outstanding that we have this lecture tradition for Marty and his leadership, but Ken and Sidra, Martin Lane, thank you for being here, and to your families for supporting the time-honored tradition here of honoring really the USAID Office of Nutrition and all the people that have been touched by it and worked with it over many decades. Today we're fortunate Ann Peniston is here. Where's Ann? Put your hand up, Ann. There you are. Thank you for your leadership. Ann, as many of you know, is leading a charge across the United States government, which we started how many years ago on the nutrition strategy? 2013. Okay. Pretty quick, I guess. In just a short couple of years, she will have marshaled through the United States government an outstanding and serious global nutrition strategy that benefits not just from the expertise of your great office, but also from colleagues across the federal government. And let me just ask, because I just love doing this, can everyone from USA just put your hand up so we see you? Thank you all for being here and for your continued leadership. We're just so proud of what you've accomplished on food, on hunger, on nutrition, on health, and more broadly on the effort to bring justice to very vulnerable communities around the world. So thank you. I certainly want to note that Schengen has been pushing me to, I think, say controversial things. He seems pretty excited about that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's a lot of controversy to share with this group, but I do think one of the nice things about getting to leave government and then look at where we stand from a different position is you can take a little bit more of a somber tone when things look like there's a disconnect between the political aspirations that are espoused and the reality of resources and attention and energy that is committed to achieve those political aspirations. And Tim Adams is doing such an outstanding job at the World Bank, was just telling me about some of the trends in funding for development finance, which are really problematic. Tim Evans, I'm sorry, I renamed you.
My wife is Adams.
Okay, good. I was like, who's Tim Adams? But Tim has really had his finger on the pulse of kind of global financing for health for many, many, many years. And I do think some of the broader trends in global financing, and underpinned and substantiated by broader trends in how political leaders are talking about current events and public affairs, especially as they relate to refugees and other threats that people perceive are being emanated from vulnerable populations, is, I think, deeply irresponsible and has the potential consequences of undermining much of the excellent work that this community of folks in this room have dedicated their lives and careers to. So I will share a few thoughts on the importance of leadership in driving forward our ambition to achieve our global goals. And in that context, I think it's useful to start this discussion with an understanding of where we stand in the global fight on hunger and malnutrition. And we're, of course, in one of the richest and most powerful countries on the face of the earth, and we live in a country and a community that is also defined by real vulnerabilities right here at home. And I think that's an important baseline to understand even as we tackle global nutrition, which I know is the focus of most of the intellectual energy certainly represented in this room. Today, there's such a high correlation between poverty and malnutrition in the United States that the numbers are almost astounding, and to people who don't know this, are frankly unbelievable. It is true that today there are 15.3 million children in the United States of America, in 20% of all households in 38 states and in Washington, D.C., that live in a condition of chronic hunger and malnutrition. And if you just think about that, that's extraordinary given the social safety net investments that this nation has made and given the high level of wealth that our country enjoys on a relative basis. And I think it presents a bit of a warning signal that assumptions that growth and economic prosperity alone will effectively tackle hunger and malnutrition are perhaps not as robust as we would hope they could be. In particular, in the United States, 23 million Americans live in food deserts, where the quality of a person's diet is defined by high content of processed fats, processed sugars, salt addition to food, and the lack of availability of basic, healthy, whole foods. And I start with that because a lot of us, in order to be able to lead an effort to address hunger and poverty at a global scale, do need to have, I think, a better and renewed sense and vision of what success looks like. But repeating the challenges imposed on the United States population, particularly on behalf of children, by reinventing an American-style food system in country after country may not generate the long-term gains in ending hunger and malnutrition that we seek to experience as a group. And I think the first challenge for us is to come up with more inclusive, more effective, and more equitable food systems in OECD economies and around the world. That then leads to the question of, well, what is happening on a global level? And Schengen and the team here at IFPRI will have updated statistics, so please forgive me if these are a bit outdated, but they certainly represent the right directional realities. Today, we believe there's somewhere between 790 and 800 million people that still have basic caloric deficiency on a daily basis. And as a result of that, we know that much of the population that lives on $1.25 a day around the world is characterized by that type of chronic, debilitating, and highly consequential perpetual hunger. We know that most of these individuals are in Asia, but it's really in Africa where 1 out of every 4 individuals are still characterized as living in a state of undernutrition. We know that poor nutrition affects and undermines and frankly contributes to, in a strong way, to more than half of all under 5 child deaths. So if we have 6.1 or 6.2 million children every year under the age of 5 who die of basic diseases, we know that the reason they succumb to simple forms of diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria has more to do with their chronic malnutrition than it often does the severity of their immediate illness. And we know that it is in that context that the world has come together to say that the first 2 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, the first 3, should be ending extreme poverty, achieving zero hunger, and effectively achieving 0 child deaths. And we need to accomplish that goal just by 2030. So then we have to get into the more questionable exercise of projecting our success and understanding the baselines we're on. Here, I've really appreciated some work done, I think funded initially maybe by USAID, but also the Gates Foundation and housed initially at the Brookings Institution. But if you look at their projected data, which is, of course, subject to all kinds of assumptions that we can maintain the current trend lines of progress, the prevalence of hunger in the developing world is, in fact, steadily declining, but still far too slowly to achieve our goals. If it's 17% in 2000 and 13% today, the estimate for 2030 on the current trend line is that it would be approximately 8%, which is very high relative to, the real goals in the SDGs of somewhere around 1 or 2% prevalence. The prevalence of stunting, or hidden hunger, as measured by the percent of stunting in children under the age of 5, 38% in 2000, 27% today, good progress, on path to be around 13% by 2030. Again, under the assumptions of maintaining current trend lines on a country-by-country basis. So if we ask ourselves, well, how are we going to dramatically accelerate our performance? We have to start raising the question that we've got to do things differently. Simply maintaining a status quo level of effort on fighting hunger and fighting malnutrition will not achieve the SDGs by 2030. And if all of this political will and political energy and political speeches that I have given, that Jim Kim has given, that so many other leaders have been associated with, including President Obama and including Angela Merkel and including Cameron and including Jokai Kikwete, we have to be willing to ask ourselves, what is it we can do differently to achieve greater success? And it's in that context that I'd like to sort of step back and offer some thoughts on a little bit of how we got here. I wanted to start with a photo of George McGovern because, in my view, one of the great things that Martin Forman was able to do in his leadership of the nutrition agenda was to bring attention to nutrition planning. From the International Nutrition Anemia Consultative Group to the International Vitamin A Consultative Group, these groups that brought people together across sectors to tackle basic concepts in malnutrition proved to be essential in advancing our thinking and our knowledge on how to fight nutrition. Similarly, George McGovern, as an extraordinary American political figure, just did a tremendous amount in his career to cut across stakeholders, including bringing serious political leadership to the task of identifying and addressing malnutrition here in the United States, but also, as those of you in this room know, very much about malnutrition abroad. And some of his early efforts, creating Food for Peace more than 60 years ago, helping to create the World Food Program, were grounded in a desire to have American agricultural largesse be part of the solution for malnutrition around the world, a well-intentioned and politically at the time achievable goal that obviously has had to be reformed and, in my view, continues to need to be reformed even today. But I wanted to start with McGovern because food security, food and hunger, the desire to support others and eliminate hunger is very much at the political core of why America has a development program, why we have a U.S. aid, how we got into this business to begin with. The early seedlings of the actual Marshall Plan were grounded in food security for Europe. And it's important that we just recognize, as folks who focus on the fight against hunger and malnutrition, that in fact this is appropriately the first leg in a broader fight for development, economic prosperity, and justice around the world for vulnerable populations. Perhaps during my tenure at USAID, the most emotional and the most significant moment for me in realizing the moral role that we have as leaders to support others came during the Somali Famine of 2011. And I know many of you have heard me share this before, but it is extraordinary to me that in 2011, at a time when the famine early warning system and FuseNet and these other tools gave us basic visibility to see this coming, we as a global community still suffered from the consequence of a famine where so many children, as many as 35,000, died because of a lack of access to food and basic nutrition during a drought that was predicted 8 or 9 months earlier. And so while the global fight against hunger and malnutrition is probably a more systemic requirement than simply immediate humanitarian relief, I think we have to continue to remind ourselves that so long as we are allowing immediate humanitarian consequences to lead to the kinds of challenges that we saw in this Somali famine, we're simply not going to be successful at fully eliminating hunger and malnutrition around the earth. And in particular, this is the Dadaab refugee camp where women and children had often walked dozens of kilometers from Somalia to get to the Kenyan border and then to a place of safety. And when those children got there, of course, the telltale signs, the red hair, the blank stares of children that were so weak from a lack of access to food and nutrition, really presented to us the most stark picture of what human suffering looks like at a time when conflict and predatory terrorist-led governance combines with drought and, frankly, a lack of effective early response to lead and allow this type of consequence to occur. And when I walked into this particular room, this was a photo that my colleague took with me, I was so focused on this mother and her child and the nasogastric tube through which he had earlier been fed and resuscitated that it took me a while to fully see and appreciate that his sibling had recently passed and was lying on the cot next to him. And this is a moral task of making sure that no one has to suffer this way from a lack of hunger and ineffective access to care when they are in a dire situation. And without going into a lot of detail, I firmly believe that the United States and the rest of the world should be doing a lot more on humanitarian response, on food security in the context of crises, on ensuring that we support displaced persons in the countries where they are displaced and when they are refugees, and on bringing the tools of modern science and technology, including electronic vouchers, including improved nutritional products like Plumpy Nut, as you see in this photograph, including what I hope is a whole new wave of enhanced nutritional products that can be deployed during humanitarian crises and emergencies. And frankly, we should stop sending American wheat and corn soy blend and things that probably cause severe negative consequences for both economies and in some cases for the health of children, and start getting much more serious about using the science and the data that we know makes a difference, even for those who are most vulnerable, even when they are at their point of greatest vulnerability and are grateful for anything. We still have a responsibility to do this work to a much higher degree of excellence and focus, and that requires political leadership. I'm extraordinarily proud of the USAID Food for Peace team for leading efforts to seek reform in the last Farm Bill. I believe the U.S. Congress needs to urgently, and this year, before the end of this administration, pass more serious food assistance reform. We are still half of the world's food aid during crises, and we are still doing it in a way that was informed by George McGovern's very well-intentioned ideas, but that was 50, 60 years ago, and it's time for us to grow up a bit. So that's one element of winning the fight against hunger and poverty. A second element, in my view, is continuing to build on the successes of our investments in agricultural development. Derek Byerly, who now teaches at Georgetown, played a huge role in creating the World Development Report in 2008, I believe, or maybe 7. 8? Rob's like, I taught you better than that, man. It was 2008. That report, I think, is perhaps, and continues to be perhaps, the most important roadmap for how the world can come together to sustainably end large-scale, in particular rural hunger around the planet. It is still true that almost 70% of the 1.1 billion people in the world who live on $1.25 a day and who account for the bulk of the chronically hungry people in the world call themselves food producers, but don't produce enough food for their families, their communities, their children, and their economic futures. And so President Obama, to his great credit, in 2009 at his very first G20, said if we're going to come together and do extraordinary things to tackle the global financial crisis, we have a moral obligation to come together and do some extraordinary things to tackle the correlated hunger crisis. And Feed the Future, which was created at that time, and through which so many of you in this room have poured a lot of ingenuity and enterprise and resources, has effectively raised billions and billions of dollars from the Congress, from private sector companies and investors, from technology partners to modernize and support a more productive, largely small-scale agriculture led by women farmers, focused on crops that bring both economic value and nutrition value to families, and help get people on their feet to move forward. And this is a wonderful farmer, I think her name was Nimna, in Senegal, that the president and I met with a few years back. And she talked about how her kids used to be at home working on the farm, often skipping meals. She would often skip the most meals because she tried to feed the kids first. It's a story many of you that do this work are very familiar with. But through the Feed the Future program, she was able to improve her agricultural productivity, improve the health and nutrition of her children, make some money, send those kids to school. And then she went on and on. They bought a tractor, she bought land nearby, now runs a co-op with like 40 other women and has some kind of a mobile phone business as well, selling SIM cards. And she's off to the races. And but the bottom line is that baseline of economic opportunity started with a focus on improving agricultural productivity on her small plot of land. And I think it is sometimes too easy to forget and too easy to move on politically from the long-term challenge we face. Feed the Future effectively, we used to say Feed the Future raised $20 billion for food security and agriculture. That's not entirely true if you take the baseline numbers out. But in 2009, the baseline of what was being invested in agriculture went up about $6 billion because of that G20 summit. And 6 is not 20, but it's a lot. And of the 6, 1.5 or so was from the United States. The Congress has an opportunity this year to pass Feed the Future as authorized legislation. I think it's one of the few things Congress can actually get done in a final year of an administration, along with food aid reform. I think they're great leaders like Chris Coons and others who are willing to champion this fight. I would point out that last December, was it last December? Yeah, last December, the House of Representatives passed Feed the Future off the floor of the House in its full authorizing capacity, and the Senate couldn't get it done. So, this next Congress has the chance, this current Congress has the chance to repeat what happened in the House and add some real Senate leadership to the task. And one of the things that should not be allowed to stand in the way is this sort of jurisdictional jockeying about are these programs about agriculture or development and foreign affairs, and which committees should be involved. The truth is all the committees should be involved. The truth is it's about both and many, many other things. And I would urge you and your colleagues and your institutions to get involved in the fight to make Feed the Future authorizing legislation real in this cycle. This past August, some extraordinary results from Feed the Future were in fact shared. And without going into all of the details, in places like Honduras, we see 40,000 households having moved sustainably out of poverty. Across the 14 Feed the Future countries, is it 14, Rob? 19. Across the 19 Feed the Future countries, 12 million children and 7.5 million farm households have been helped. And of those, we now have real data on the actual performance in those households, on income, on women's empowerment, on children moving out of a condition of undernutrition. One of the data points that I frankly found most surprising was the speed and scale at which stunting reductions were documented in places like Ethiopia and elsewhere in Feed the Future zones of influence. I had always believed that stunting is such a long-term, biologically permanent process that you really wouldn't see quick and rapid reductions. But I believe, and Rob or Julie or someone could correct me, and you might know the data better than I do, but I believe we saw 9 or 10% reductions. Is that right in Ethiopia? 9%? What's that? 2 or 3 percentage points a year. Oh, right. Okay, yeah, 9 percentage point reduction in just a few years of that program, with against strong baseline surveys and with real proper evaluation skills. Something that Richard Green, who's probably not here, I think we owe him a debt of gratitude for insisting on the rigor of those evaluations. But what did it teach us? It taught us that agricultural programming done well in poor places can have sustainable and profound impacts on eliminating hunger in communities if we stick with it and do this with purpose and measure results and insist on performance. And that's what we've seen across the board. Now, I should point out, one of the things I'm very concerned about is, as we've had a long-standing run of strong commodity prices and foreign direct investment into rapidly growing African economies in particular, many of which are feed the future countries, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana. I think the current skittishness and the current commodity price collapse and the consequent realities about less economic investment and activity in some of these markets will at some point trickle down and affect the growth path and the improvement trajectory in the quality of life for people we all try to serve through these efforts. So if there's one thing I've learned since leaving USAID and being in the investment space, is those larger macroeconomic trends do play a significant role in defining the opportunity set for populations we try to serve, and perhaps we as a community here can do more to understand the links between our specific program activities and those larger trends and consequences. This is a photo of President Obama at in Ethiopia this summer, also looking at food processing programs that came out of Feed the Future in particular. So we've talked about leadership and investment and policies in order to improve the fight against hunger. Technology is obviously something I have been extraordinarily passionate about, and I believe plays a huge and defining role in the ability of our global community to effectively fight hunger and malnutrition. And we together, in my view, have to continue to fight for a more open and more accepting mindset in country after country for the use of modern technology to allow for more resilient, especially climate resilient crops to be effective and part of the growing systems of so many of these countries. We've seen that even with the climate agreements reached, and even if those really, let's call them stretch goals, are achieved that came out of Paris, we still know that you're going to have 2 to 3 degree Celsius changes in the growing environments in the poorest countries. And we know that those types of changes, hotter, drier, more erratic growing conditions, threaten to put 25, 30, 35% downward pressure on productivity in the major crops in the places where food production is most tightly correlated with actual hunger and family nutrition performance. So if we continue, in my view, to have a very slow role of creating and adopting new technologies in food systems, in this case, I believe this is around, the photos you're looking at have to do with drought resistance being bred into crops in West Africa, most of which is not using transgenic technology, but some of which does use transgenic technology. We need a system that is far more effective and open at getting these technologies deployed if we're going to have a serious shot at achieving the SDGs. The final concept that I just want to share is the importance of leadership in this overall fight. This is a photo that I was proud to convince the president and the former president to take together on a joint visit in Tanzania. Ironically, and now I can show the picture, I guess, but I was told not to use it too much when they gave it to me. But you know, look, if we're being serious, the biggest gains in American developmental work around the world have been in areas like health and agriculture over the last 10 to 15 years. Those gains have only happened because conservative Republicans, often driven to support this work through their faith, have held hands with liberal, globally minded Democrats. And both communities have said to members of both parties that would rather we keep the money at home or we retract from real global leadership because of our fiscal challenges, have said that you got to think differently about how we project leadership as Americans around the world. And whether it's PEPFAR, which of course was a major advance in transforming the reality of HIV/AIDS, or malaria, which led to a 50% reduction in child death from malaria in sub-Saharan Africa over a decade, or Feed the Future and the reinvigoration of investment in agricultural research and science and distribution and farm-level extension and support around the continent of Africa and in many other countries around the world. Either way, the politics that sustained those gains were the exact same. And I think it is incumbent on, in this last year of this administration and in future administrations, for leaders to project that the fight against nutrition and poverty is an extraordinarily important one in our foreign policy, and for leaders to not just talk about it, but do the hard political work of building those relationships across the aisle and sustaining the gains that we have experienced over the last 15 years. And as you heard from my opening comments, the gains we've experienced are not enough to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So the reality is we're going to need a stronger politics that allows us to do more. So let me put that in blunt terms. In the United States, despite 15 years ago or 10 years ago having a broader global construct that 0.7% of GDP can and should be invested in global development efforts, we've been lucky to get to 0.1%, 0.125%. We need to do more in this country. And Michael Gerson, a very prominent and committed Republican leader who worked with President Bush, and myself have recently authored a paper for a book called Moneyball for Government, where we delineate 6 or 7 things that the next administration can do to enhance both the politics and the practice of this work. And I hope you can download it, I think, for free on Amazon.com. And it's not, it's basic stuff. It's stuff that everyone in this room takes for granted, that aid and assistance is not about writing checks to dictators to buy favor. It might have been at one point, but it cannot be today. And whether we're investing in Pakistan or Egypt or Tanzania or Ghana, we have to measure results, be driven by evidence in the work that we do, be willing to innovate in doing different things in order to deliver even better results. And we have to approach the work with the mindset that it's the results of fewer people living in chronic undernutrition or fewer people dying under the age of 5 unnecessarily that are the gains we seek, not just the press releases and the meeting photos that are taken when the programs are announced. And I'm very hopeful that once we get beyond the silly season of current political debate, serious leaders will emerge who have that mindset. I know, as you know, I know, Secretary Clinton absolutely does. And we also see some on the Republican side that share that strong point of view. But the rhetoric today is obviously not at its best when it comes to how America should be projecting leadership around the world. And I think this sort of fear-mongering around refugees in particular is particularly detrimental because it's an easy way to scare people as opposed to the harder but more important task of inspiring Americans to lead. Similarly, around the world, you'll have similar movements and realities in the United Kingdom and the Scandinavian countries that have traditionally done a lot and are now, for a variety of reasons, retracting. and in countries themselves that I think as they deal with the tougher global macroeconomy will find it harder and harder to achieve goals like the 15% and 10% CAADP targets for agricultural spending or health spending. So I will just conclude with maybe just two thoughts. One is a point, I don't see the slide here, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things I think we don't do in our fight on undernutrition is, going back to my original point about the statistics in America, is to really understand what the future looks like for middle-income countries that have very large populations like China and India, and what does success really look like for their food systems. I've never seen a good answer in 15 years of looking and having the luxury of asking the world's best experts. I've never seen a good answer for why can a country like India grow so fast for so long and make so little progress against child malnutrition. That's an answer we should have, we should understand, and we should be able to do something about that. Similarly, I do not see a good answer to the question of if you project the future of China's food system forward 20 years, is the bulk of food intake by low-income Chinese in 2040 and 2050 going to be what it is in the United States? Highly processed, unhealthy, low cost, but sickening foods. Or is it going to be something that is going to afford a better baseline of nutrition and health, particularly for the poorest quintiles within those populations? And those are the types of questions I wanted to raise here at IFPRI, because a lot of our fight, Shengyin, over the last decade or two has been focused on the most impoverished places in the world. And I hope some of your work can also expand to tackle those types of questions, to project forward what does success really look like in places that 20 years from now will not be characterized as places of large scale, large prevalence poverty, and just the quality of the food system, especially for the poorest within those countries, will mean a lot as to whether we've achieved the goal that Marty Forman cares so much about. Final comment, this is a photo of a woman in South Sudan. South Sudan was the place I had a lot of optimism about when I started at USAID, showing my perhaps naive optimism, and now have grown somewhat disenchanted with in terms of their statistics and their performance. To me, it's an example of a place that has real assets and resources and opportunity, and at different points in time, real global and local political will to change the face of poverty and hunger and malnutrition, but where governance and politics have always prioritized more parochial interests than the welfare of populations. And as a result of that, this young girl, like any other young girl born in South Sudan today, is still statistically more likely to die in childbirth than to complete high school. And our fight for ending hunger, ending malnutrition, and bringing a more just development pathway to country after country is about ensuring that we bring real justice to girls like that all over the world. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you to the Forman family, and thanks to IFPRI and those of you that are here today. Thanks very much.